Well, I like that you focus on those things, and I like that you're vocal about them. I've talked with a few people, from journalists to Border Patrol agents working on the American side, and we've talked about everything from child trafficking, fentanyl, a variety of issues. And it's interesting how a lot of it does come back to China. China's not making fentanyl, but perhaps they're shipping all of the precursors to Mexico where fentanyl is being made, and then it's working its way up. Can you give me, because I do want to talk about China.
Sure.
Can you give me a snapshot of the current situation? And I mean everything from the police, not necessarily the units that you used to work with, but just the overall tie between, cartels and police and the corruption there, and then the political side as well.
Sure.
The reason I ask you is if you go to, it almost seems impossible. A better way to frame it would be, I don't know where to point people towards in the U.S. in the media where they're not being fed a galactic amount of bullshit about what is going on.
Yeah. So first off, I'm an immigrant to the U.S. I did it legally, and I am earning my way to citizenship. I am part of a business, and I have charities that we work with. We've raised money for veterans, do a lot. I'm not a journalist. I am somebody like yourself that through experience gained a knowledge base that is now part of our opinion on things. I don't talk about things from I remember or I think this is what happened. I was there for some of the origin points of some of the issues that are now exploding in the U.S. I mean, I was a part of the group that found the first cartel drone on the border. Like I found one of the first quad drones with a giant load of meth underneath it, and I had to Google what the fuck I was looking at. Right. I also was a part of a lot of training, and I trained a lot of members of law enforcement in Mexico, and I have connections and still talk to a lot of them who are spread between some of the Army SF groups, some of the Marina SF groups, also some of the federal units and what the remains of them, because it was an institution that was completely gutted by the current leftist organization that is running Mexico. So my opinions come from that baseline. I have no stakes in the game. I am not part of any political party of any kind, and I can't vote in the United States still till I get in citizenship. So I want to preface everything by that first. Mexico is, I think, like right now, it's in a civil war that is basically being ignored. It's very much a civil war of a sort, and the first indications that I saw of China's participation in all of this was specifically in related to the ports of Mexico. Anything that comes into Mexico from the ocean comes through a port, and all the ports are militarized in Mexico. They're run by the Department of the Navy in Mexico. The amount of times that we saw members of these units, and as far as higher ups, and again, we had eyes and ears everywhere, as well as probably they did. So we would witness, Chinese businessmen that would run giant maquiladoras or business interests in Baja and other places have meetings with members of these institutions that were weird. I got to witness the shift of some of these methamphetamine, crystal meth processes go from like small batches in some weird laboratory somewhere to now industrial level loads of it with giant crystal shards showing up on the street, and also showing up in cars that were loaded up to go to the U.S. And a few times we found some Chinese nationals in some of these laboratories basically showing and educating some of these people to do what they do. It became quickly apparent to me and to anybody I asked, because who do we ask? We did our research. I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine who was in the intelligence community. He said that any Chinese national is part of the Chinese state, and as such, they're all members of, they're all Chinese intelligence, basically. There's no such thing as separating, Chinese criminals and that are acting independently of the Chinese state. This doesn't work that way. Like everybody's
country structured.
Yeah, everybody's in on it basically. And as soon as we started asking and poking around and commenting on that shit, we were shut down immediately. So I knew there was something there. And this is early on when that methamphetamine started being basically mass produced. And then it shifted to fentanyl. As soon as marijuana legalization happened and products started shifting and things started changing around that, and then giant pot grows in Mexico started not being as valuable as they were in the past. Somebody started figuring out that you can take some of that low potency heroin grown on some of those fields and add fentanyl into it. And these people were not Mexicans. These were Chinese nationals that were already in Mexico as part of the pharmaceutical industry, because that's their foothold in Mexico. That's how they got into Mexico. Mm-hmm. There's a famous case of a Chinese Mexican national, Sen Li Jiegon, which has the record as far as the amount of money found in a single drug-related bust. Over 100 million in his house.
In cash?
In cash.
Holy shit. That must have been a big house.
It was a lot of suitcases and it was everywhere. There was luxury watches. Like people were counting that money naked in a room. And it was a whole thing.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. And when you see that case and you see what he was involved in, he was involved in legitimate pharmaceutical industry stuff in Mexico. So it wasn't like they were smuggling hidden containers of fentanyl or methamphetamine precursors in a secret compartment, a hole in a ship. They were pumping it in directly into the pharmaceutical industry. And guess who was a part of that pharmaceutical industry? You know, some of these members of some of these cartels were basically there just take, take this for us and do that. Mm-hmm. So that's how that started to grow. We start to see, and I think the U.S. caught on to it later. We start to see some of the Chinese banking industry and some of these banking maneuvers that they were doing in their own money processes, having some links to places in the U.S. You know, that's how they would make money disappear on the U.S. side and make it appear on the Mexican side. Money brokers from China that were using some of the Chinese institutions to move around some of that cash, some of that money. You know, in the past, you would see cars loaded with money driving down to Mexico. You know, that you would see some of that. That's not that common anymore because that's passe. You know, not using that anymore. So you start seeing clear evolution of some of these criminal organizations and their influence from some of the supply networks in China. And then, I guess, probably 6 years ago, almost 7, I guess, you'd start seeing a clear sign that at least one of these giant criminal organizations in Mexico, the New Generation Cartel, was very, very much being supplied and equipped by some sort of pipeline from Southeast Asia. People have seen the videos of these guys wearing signal disruptors on their kit, basically these modules that will interrupt any sort of ability for somebody to call out or phone or radio or some different frequency.
It's a jammer, for lack of a better term. That's what we used to use as well.
Yeah. Imagine those, but made in China and smaller, you know? Yeah. And each of them they're carrying a bunch of them on them, and they have a bunch of bootleg Black Hawk gear on, made in China, and a bunch of plate armor and helmets that clearly made in China, and a bunch of a bunch of tactical gear that clearly comes from Southeast Asia and China, and drones and pill presses that are manufactured and sold by official institutions in China that are now being utilized to make bogus pain medication with fentanyl laced in them. And all that originates from a Pacific side based cartel, the New Generation Cartel, who has access and control over some of the major ports like the one in Colima and Manzanillo. And you can clearly see a pipeline and a sign that they're basically in cahoots and or somehow influenced or proxied by China. And when I started talking about this way back when, I think I talked about it the first time I was on Rogan, I was called I was fucking making shit up, or I was hallucinating this, or it's conspiracy of some sort, you know, or I was somehow racist for saying that and anti-China. And when COVID hit, the Sinaloa cartel was smuggling fentanyl from the U.S. into Mexico to load their drugs because they don't have access to the Pacific side ports. And the New Generation cartel exploded in influence and power during that time because the pipelines didn't close for them. Supposedly China was in lockdown. Why were ships still showing up?
Do you think that relationship between China, I'm just trying to think about, is it mutually beneficial from a monetary perspective? Or do you think that China is at a point in their supply chain, because especially if the economics of the cartel is largely being derived through that trafficking, is it at a point where China can actually exert influence over those cartels and almost use them as a proxy against the U.S. if they wanted to?
I think it's clear that at least with one of them, it's true. It's probably true with the New Generation cartel. We've heard stories, and there's a bunch of people out there that are way more qualified to talk about this, but I'll speak about what I know and heard of illegal iron ore mining along the Pacific side of the country. That these cartels would hire cartels as security to basically keep people away from them. There was a whole hoopla online probably 10 years ago about these self-defense organizations that came up in Mexico, these autodefensas. You would see them wearing white t-shirts. I think Netflix actually did a documentary on some of these guys. It turned out that most of them were not citizens arming themselves to fight the cartels. They were just basically another version of the cartels trying to gain control of a whole plaza. And some of these guys were being hired by illegal mining operations in that area to extract iron ore. So they've clearly figured out ways of manipulating and using some of these influences, I think they've done the same in places like Africa. But what I see is, yes, they are clearly probably being used as a proxy group of some sort. Now, I don't think their intentions are just exploitative as far as exploiting resources and making money off them. I see them as a weapon of this destabilization and influence in your second largest trading partner in the world, and also your neighbor to the south. That's what I see.
Yeah, you have China is one of the largest, if not the largest, trading partner for the U.S. So from an economic consumer facing, I mean, where do your Apple computers come from and your iPhones? If you ever order one and you check the shipping label, I'm here to tell you right now, it comes from China with a lot of other things. And so they have that economic front. And then on the back end, I mean, it's a long play, but destabilizing the country in and of itself through what they are pumping through using the cartels, if that is in fact what they are doing, but destabilizing a large portion of populace of the United States.
Yeah,
I mean, the things that but an interesting two-sided battle, though. It's very asymmetrical.
You see the political structure in Mexico right now basically being formed to a single unit.